Good evening, I'm Terry McCarthy, I'm the President of the Academy. Our speaker tonight, Fred Donner, he's the Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Near Eastern History at the University of Chicago. He's written a bunch of books, including The Early Islamic Conquests, Narratives of Islamic Origins, and more recently, Muhammad and the Believers, which created quite a lot of attention, as I understand. I give you Fred Donner.
Thank you, Terry, very much for your kind words. So my topic tonight is Islam's origins, myth, and material evidence. As most of you surely know, there has long been a standard or traditional view of how Islam began. In reference to this standard view, the great French historian Ernest Renan said in the 19th century that Islam was, quote, born in the full light of history. But since that time, it has become ever clearer that what I call the traditional Islamic origins narrative, which almost everyone accepted with considerable confidence, is far less secure than we once thought. First, however, I think I need to sketch very quickly the outlines of this traditional view of how Islam began for those of you who are not familiar with it. And I know there are many people in the audience, many of you are my colleagues from the Freie Universität or elsewhere and are very familiar with it. So set your snooze alarm for about 8 or 9 minutes and I'll get through this. So at the center of this traditional narrative is the person of Muhammad, who is recognized by Muslim tradition as the prophet who brought God's revelation to his followers. The traditional death date for Muhammad is given as 632 Common Era, so first third of the 7th century. So he was seen, or is seen, as the founder of a new religion, which we call Islam. And he was born and raised at first in the city of Mecca. Here's a photograph of Mecca, not from the time of the Prophet, I'm sorry to say, but around 1900 maybe, or late 19th, early 20th century. Now, the town of Mecca, small even in the late 19th century, of course very small in the 7th century, maybe a few thousand people. But nonetheless, it was a town that had a pagan or polytheistic population, that is, people worshiped many different gods. And it had an important shrine as a center, in the center of the town, which you can see here, the famous Kaaba, or basically it means a cube in Arabic. And this was the center of various pagan rites, which the Quraysh tribe, the tribe of Mecca, supervised and profited from by taking care of all the pilgrims who came to the town. So Mecca had this important cultic life, or so we are told, and it was also a town that was supported by commercial life because it was a center of a caravan trade in which the Meccan merchants organized caravans that went south to the Yemen and north to Syria and northeast to Iraq and so on, carrying various goods, some of them reputedly luxury goods, great distances, and this was part of the economic basis of the city. Okay, here's another picture, I think a little bit more recent, but closer up so you get to see the Kaaba shrine in the middle and various other buildings around it. Well, at about age 40, Muhammad was raised in this town in the pagan environment, but he was and he seems to have been a promising young man, but at about age 40, he was on a kind of retreat. He used to go off to get away from it all and sit quietly in the outskirts of the city and reflect on life or whatever. And at one point, he began to receive what he took to be revelations from God. That is, he felt like he was overcome with this sense of a presence, and he was seeing and especially hearing things and kind of in a trance-like state, we are told. And when he came out of it, he had a passage of text that was kind of burned into his memory, and he could recite it. And so he proceeded to go back, at first with great trepidation, and tell his family and friends about these experiences. Some of them then became followers in his new religious ideas that were part of this. So this is, in Muslim tradition, this is the revelation of God's word to the prophet. And he had these episodes periodically during his life when he would get a new download of more material. And this material then was memorized by him, but it was also memorized by his followers. He would recite it to them, and they would gradually learn it. Some of them wrote it down in pieces of stuff that was written. And after he died, then all these recitations were collected by a kind of editorial committee, and all the written pieces were gathered together, and they produced a sort of complete single text, which is the text of the Quran, the sacred scripture of Muslims. So for Muslims, the Quran is literally God's word as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. And in case you didn't realize it, of course, the Quran is in Arabic, so God speaks Arabic. So, if you have any sense and want to be well cared for in the afterlife, you should definitely take Arabic. Well, what were the fundamental ideas he was preaching? We can deduce most of these from the Quran text itself. The central one, of course, is the idea of monotheism, a very strict understanding of monotheism, that there is only one God, the creator God, who creates the world, creates us, creates everything in the universe. And that because this God is all-powerful and all-creating, we owe him our gratitude in forms of prayer and so on. Obviously, the tradition, the package of religious ideas also includes the notion of prophecy. Since Muhammad was a prophet, the idea that God singles out specific individuals to receive his guidance for mankind. And it includes the idea of a revealed book which contains some kind of guidance or law for the community of believers. Also quite prevalent in certain parts of the Quran is warnings about the impending last judgment. That is the idea that the end of time is going to come maybe sometime soon, and that we better be ready for it. And that what will happen at the end of time is that we will all be hauled before the divine judge, including all the dead who will be raised from the dead. All the souls will be awakened. Everyone will come forth before God, and we will all be judged individually, depending on how we behaved in this life that we have or had. And then will we be either rewarded by being sent to heaven or punished by being sent to hell. And this, of course, then means that there's a strong emphasis also on piety or God-fearingness, the idea that if you're going to be saved in this life, you really need to behave yourself, right? You shouldn't do things that God finds hateful in social discourse and so on. So there's a strong emphasis on pious behavior, as well as this more abstract notion of a single God who creates everything. Well, the preaching of these ideas by Muhammad, he did win some followers, quite a few, it seems. But it also generated quite a bit of opposition in the town of Mecca, in his hometown, from some of his kinsmen. The simplest way to put it is because, well, maybe they felt their economic ties were somehow threatened, but mainly I think they were appalled at the idea that some of their ancestors, since this was a culture that engaged, it was a tribally organized culture, and they all identified themselves as descendants of some ancestor whom they revered. The idea that these ancestors were pagans and therefore were going to be going to hell was not welcome news to them. So they didn't really like this set of preachings. And so there was increasing opposition to Muhammad and his followers who were trying to do their prayers and other devotions from time to time, and they would be ridiculed or abused in various ways by their townsmen. So finally, it was necessary for them to go somewhere else. Fortunately, just as things were coming to a head, a crisis point, a delegation of people came from the town of Yathrib, which is about 350 kilometers north of Mecca in Western Arabia, and invited Muhammad and his followers to come to Yathrib to be arbiters of their own city's kind of internal squabbles among different tribal groups. And so Muhammad and his followers in the year 622 make their emigration from Mecca to Yathrib, which comes to be known later as Medina, the city of the Prophet. This event is known as the Hijra, the emigration. And it's an important moment because it marks the beginning of the first autonomous, sort of self-governing Muslim community. In Mecca, the Muslims were not able to be self-governing. There were lots of non-believers around who really controlled things. But in Yathrib or Medina, they were able to sort of organize themselves as a community as they wished to. And it's also important, this Hijrah in 622, because it's the starting date for the Muslim calendar. It came to be taken later as the starting point of the Muslim calendar. So when you see Muslim dates, they go back to this event in 622. Although, because the Muslim year is only 356 days long, instead of 300, it's a lunar year, it means that you can't just subtract 622 from a common era date and get the right Islamic date. You have to go to a table or a conversion schedule somehow. So Muhammad was then living in Yathrib with his followers. There was tension between him and his followers on the one hand, and some of the people in Yathrib who joined him and became very close to him, and others in Yathrib who, again, felt a certain distance or took a somewhat more skeptical attitude towards his activities. And so he had a long period of 7 or 8 years where he was trying to, and successfully did overcome the opposition of these various groups. Among them, the most famous or infamous episodes have to do with several large Jewish clans in the city of Yathrib. It had clans of people who were Jews, but also people who were not Jews. They were presumably pagans of some kind. They all converted to Islam, apparently, and accepted the idea of monotheism. The Jews, of course, were already monotheists. They didn't have to change at all. But there developed, it seems, according to the traditional narrative, intense or tensions between Muhammad and his followers on the one hand and some of these Jewish clans, which resulted in some rather ugly episodes in which the Jews were driven out of the community, or in one case the Jewish clan was basically, all the men were executed and the women and children taken in as slaves. If these stories are true, and that's a question about this whole later narration of what happened, but come to that another time. In any case, as he was consolidating his position in Yathrib or Medina, he and his followers were also beginning to proselytize outside of the city of Yathrib and win following from among different tribal groups and small villages, mostly pastoral nomadic tribal groups in the vicinity. Ultimately, it was possible to confront the city of Mecca, where he had come from. The Meccans had attacked Yathrib a couple of times, actually. Finally, after several years, the Prophet was able to go back and take over Mecca in a more or less peaceable way. He just came in and occupied it, and the Meccans agreed that they would accept his new faith and admit him to the city. And so he and his followers came in, and they did pilgrimage at the site of the Kaaba, and they were now part of this growing state in Western Arabia with Medina at its center. The Prophet stayed in Medina. He went back to Medina. He didn't stay in his hometown. And so this begins a process of expansion of the Islamic State that was astonishingly rapid, starting after his death in 632. After his death, instead of the state falling apart, his followers organized themselves and began to press out to take ever larger areas, a process usually called something like the Islamic conquest or the Arab conquest. I don't like either term very much, but that's the term that's usually used for it. And in the process of this, we can see from the map, there's a very rapid expansion. This dark green is the area that was controlled more or less by the time of the Prophet's death. Within a couple of years, the rest of the Arabian Peninsula had been taken over by armies organized by his first successor, a man named Abu Bakr. And then shortly thereafter, within a few more years, a decade or two, this whole area, including Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and much of Iran, was taken over. And they kept pushing to the horizons, so that by, say, 740, they controlled all the way from Spain all the way to the Indus River Valley here. So it was a very rapid expansion. The first 30 or 40 years sort of inexplicably rapid, and historians, including myself, have puzzled over this for a very long time to understand how this could be, especially because the expansion started in a place, namely Medina and Western Arabia, that, first of all, had no tradition of statecraft, and second of all, had no obvious resources to support an expansion. So how was this possible? And in the process, they overthrew one of the two great powers of the day, the Sasanian Empire, which had been situated on the Iranian plateau and in Iraq, in this area. They completely overthrew that, and they took away about half of the later Roman or Byzantine Empire, which was centered in Constantinople, but had controlled Syria and Egypt and large areas around the Mediterranean. They managed to take these territories away from these two empires somehow, without obvious means of doing so. Here's another map showing the expansion and showing, in a rather speculative way, I think I can say, the possible routes of some of the armies in this multifaceted process of expansion. Okay, so that's basically the outline of the traditional origins narrative. I already mentioned some of the problems that seem to inhere in it, but not all of them by any means. And the problems are numerous, and they're very deep, actually. First of all, this picture is based on, it's a voluminous picture. We have tons of detail about all aspects of it, pretty much. But it's based on sources that are much later. The sources are mostly literary sources, chronicles, biographical dictionaries, and the like, that come from the later Muslim community, and most of them were not written until 2 or 3 centuries after the events that they're supposed to be describing the life of the Prophet. They're not from the 7th century. They are from the later 8th century or the 9th century, the 10th century, and even later in some cases. Yes, some of these later sources rely on earlier reports that were apparently transmitted orally, or maybe they were written down in notebooks that have been lost, and so the reports are subsumed into these later compilations. But there's very little, we have to be very skeptical about the idea that any of these things really goes back to original documents from the time of the Prophet or of the early conquests. So there's that sort of problem in principle with the evidence that it is later. Another problem is that when we look at the different Muslim narratives about what happened in the origins period, we find a lot of contradictions in the sources between one report and another report. And, well, how do you sort out these contradictions? For a century or more, lots of people tried to sort of attack these accounts and harmonize them, work out a way to sort of see if they could all be seen as valid, but it was kind of a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of some small thing. But more and more that seemed to be not possible. There just seemed to be sort of irreconcilable differences between some of those sources. Another problem was that the narration, however you took it, from these Muslim sources of later date seemed to conflict with the narrations that we have from non-Muslim sources, mainly Christian sources, that were written somewhat earlier, that were written in the later 7th century and the early 8th century, so before the Muslim sources were written down. We have from the Christian community some descriptions of these new people coming and what was happening. And while in some ways they track with the Muslim sources, not too badly, in other ways they seem to be quite at variance with what the Muslim sources say. And finally, this traditional narrative is based on almost no actual documentation. That is, no texts or documents or real artifacts that came from the time itself and from the people themselves who were making this history. And, you know, historians like to work with documents. That's the most secure basis for us to reconstruct the past. But there were very few documents actually available from this period, as it turns out. And the ones that were available basically weren't used, and I think they weren't used by Western scholars for a long time, mainly because Western scholars already had a nice prepackaged story, the traditional origins narrative story coming out of these narrative sources. And so working with the actual documents, which are miserable scraps of papyrus and coins and so on, so all these little bits of information, it's very hard to get a general picture. It's very hard to put it together. It's much easier to just read these narrations of what actually happened, right? And so I think that was one of the reasons why, at least for 100 years or so, people really didn't pay that much attention to the documentary evidence. Well, now that people seem to be more aware, since about the 1970s, scholars are more aware that we can't just go on using the traditional origins narrative as a basis for our own understanding. We have to come to a somehow more scientific, historically scientific view of what was going on. There's been a kind of paradigm shift, I think, but Western scholars attempted to figure out ways that we could get a better picture. One, of course, was to look at the traditional sources like these and to try to make minor modifications to harmonize things, but as I said, that wasn't really a process that worked very well. Here's a few of the things that have come out in recent years. I could put my own book in there, but my recent one, but I didn't. On the other hand, there were some scholars who said this traditional picture is so completely wrong that we need to just throw it out completely and start over using only documents and a few things. And in fact, this I think is going too far. One scholar, John Wansbrough, he was an American, but he taught at the University of London for most of his life, even opined that, we'll never be able to know what actually happened at the beginnings of Islam, and historians should just stop trying. And, well, for me as a historian, this is not a very satisfying way to look at things. I think we need to do more. This approach is a little bit too radical. The fact is that there are some documents that confirm bits of information we find in the traditional narrative sources. And so we can't just throw out the traditional narratives entirely, even though we have to be very circumspect in using them. And this rather complicated looking chart, I hope is not too complicated, so you have a timeline at the bottom of dates. And so Muhammad dies somewhere here around 632. The Umayyad dynasty comes to rule in 660 and rules to 750, and the Abbasid dynasty overthrows them in 750 and rules until 1258, actually. And the Quran, as far as we can tell, crystallizes. Muslim tradition would say it crystallizes already by hearsay, but I think recent work in Quran manuscripts suggests that maybe it's still undergoing some evolution up until about 700. We don't really know yet. This is work that's going on as we speak still today. Then you have documentary sources produced first by the people in this believers movement itself. So I put D's here to give an idea. So we have a few in the 7th century and then more and more and more. Now this might be a coin or a scrap of papyrus. It may not tell us a whole lot, but it tells us something. The Christian sources, often literary sources that are a little bit more expansive, some of those are earlier. So we can get information from them and try to piece this together. And so the challenge now is to try to piece all this together and fit it into the beginnings of the narrative sources, which, as you see, really start up about here and become voluminous at this point. And they project back what they thought had happened to this much earlier period. So you have to somehow work with these different categories of material and to try to assemble a more, shall we say, plausible narrative. So I think that it makes sense then to start with the earliest information dating from the 7th century that we can find, the true narrative information, or whatever kinds of material we have from the 7th century, and then maybe tap that into the traditional origins narrative as we feel we can connect it. And this information from the 7th century then comes especially from two sources, information from within the community itself. One is the Quran text, and the other is documentary evidence like, say, coins or papyri. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the Quran. This is a leaf of a very early Quran that was found in Yemen, in the Great Mosque in Yemen. Seems to be a 7th century document. And as I said, the Quran is generally thought to be an early text. And so, well, maybe we can use it as a quasi-documentary source of information. We can, I suppose, but the problems with it are several. One in particular is that the Quran text doesn't say much about the events of Muhammad's day when it was supposedly revealed. It's God's word, after all, not Muhammad's word. It's a kind of, it gives us many, what you might call, timeless moral lessons about how we're supposed to lead our lives, sometimes talking about previous communities of believers and previous prophets and what happened to them as moral lessons. So we should wise up and know how we should behave on the basis of these lessons. It's full of passages that we can take as moral exhortations, do this and don't do that, but that doesn't really tell you much about what was happening at the time. And then there are some passages, not a few actually, that give us what we might call legal material or guidelines for conduct, how to behave, how to act in our lives. So that's one problem with the Quran. It doesn't actually give us a lot of historical nitty-gritty as we would like to have it. Secondly, the Quran text itself is, I think, very poorly understood by Western scholars. What was this text? If you don't accept it as God's revelation to the prophet, then what was it as a text? When and where did it come from? How did it coalesce into the form in which we have it now? Islamic tradition, of course, knows that this is God's revelation as revealed to the prophet and set down in set form, fixed form, at a very early date, already by the 650s in the eyes of Muslim tradition. But to historians who look at this material with, I think, an open mind, we have to admit that the historical context of the Quran is anything but clear, and the amount of time it took for it to congeal into a text is not clear, although I think by 700 or so, we can certainly say that the text was pretty much set. But before that, I think there's still a lot of question about what was going on with this text, and only more research will hopefully clarify that question. There are even theories of a much later origin for the Quran. This same scholar I mentioned before, John Wansbrough, thought that the text maybe didn't coalesce until the 9th century. I think that's going much too far, and the evidence of the actual Quran manuscript suggests that it's earlier than that. He also proposed that the text didn't crystallize or coalesce in Arabia, in Medina, or anywhere else, but somewhere outside of Arabia, perhaps southern Iraq, where there were lots of Christian and Jewish communities that seem to be referred to in the Quran text. Well, as I said, I think the evidence shows that the Quran text is mostly early, although I think there are perhaps some later interpolations into it from the late 7th century. But even if the text was fixed in its written form, another problem is that the way Arabic was written in this early period, because Arabic did not have a long tradition of being written as a language at this time, the script system was exceedingly defective. There were many letters that several different sounds used the same letter form. There are no diacritical marks that are later given to be able, so you can distinguish between these different letters that are given in the same form. The vowels were not written. Even the long vowels, most of them were not written. So you could look at a set of letters and read it in a whole bunch of different ways sometimes, and which brings a different meaning. So even if the writing was stable, the meaning may not have been so stable. So these are all questions about the text of the Quran as it seems first to have been around in the 7th century. But I think we can say that the text is early enough that it gives us at least, there are certain things in it that are unmistakable, the idea of monotheism and a bunch of other religious ideas. And I think that we can say that at least it's sufficient to give us a good idea of what the guiding principles, religious principles and moral principles of this new community were. They're the ones I suggested to you at the beginning: monotheism, worry about the last judgment, living righteously, and so on. But when we look at the text of the Quran, we can notice immediately certain things that do not line up with the traditional Muslim view. One is that we notice that the words Islam and Muslim are seldom used in the Quran text, actually. The word Islam occurs only 8 times. The word Muslim occurs about 60 times. And they mean something different than what they came to mean later on, after 700 or so. Muslim in the Quran means someone who submits himself to God's will. The verb aslama means you submit yourself to God's will. That is, you recognize that there's only one God and that He is sovereign over all of us, and we have to, you devote yourself to God in some way. Muslim then means that you're submitted to God, but it doesn't mean you're a follower of a particular religion with the name of Islam. And similarly, the word Islam means the act of submitting to God's will. It isn't a name for a religion yet, it doesn't seem to be. And the way it's used in various sentences makes that quite clear. We can see an example of this in Quran, Surah 3, or chapter 3, verse 67, where it says, Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but rather he was, what it says, Hanifan Musliman, which means something like a monotheist who submitted himself to God's will. So Abraham was, in that sense, a Muslim. He wasn't in the later sense with a capital M, a Muslim, obviously. So Muslim is seldom used in the Quran. Islam even less frequently. Instead, we see that the main term of address in the Quran, the people to whom it's being addressed, and the main term of identity for these people was a related word, which means believers. That was mu'min is believer, or mu'minun is believers, which is used about 1,000 times in the Quran. It's overwhelmingly more frequent. And so this is why I prefer, in the 7th century, really not to talk about Muslims and Islam, but to talk about the believers' movement, because that seems to be what these people, how they thought of themselves and what they called themselves. And it's also very interesting when we look into the Quran text that there are some passages in the Quran that make it clear that Christians and Jews, who after all are monotheists, or think of themselves as monotheists, those who are adequately pious, were considered among the believers. So we have this creation of this new community that could have included some Christians and Jews. Quran 2:62, for example, goes, those who believe, and Jews and Christians and Sabians, those who believe in God and the last day and who act righteously, shall receive their reward with their Lord, and they shall neither fear nor feel distress. So they're being promised felicity in the afterlife, because they are believers in the one God and in the last day and so on, and are living righteously. That's also very important. So in short, this early community that Muhammad founded seems not to have been limited to what we today call Muslims, but was apparently a kind of maybe a monotheistic revival movement focused on the ideas of God's oneness, the need for piety among his followers, and fear of the Last Judgment, which again, the Prophet may have expected to happen at any time. There are a few passages that suggest the imminence of it. Now, the notion that some Jews and Christians may have been part of the believers' movement, we see implied in the Quran, obviously opens many new possibilities for interpretation. For one thing, it forces us to question the appropriateness of the very notion of conversion for the first several generations of this movement, that is in the 7th century, since conversion implies movement from one clearly defined set of religious doctrines to another, or from one clearly defined religious community to another. But in the early believers movement, as far as we can tell, we seem to have a community in which religious doctrines, beyond the idea of strict monotheism, were still kind of being felt out or worked out, still forming up. And there is evidence of a lot of fluidity between the Arabian believers and others, especially Christians, with whom they came into contact in the lands that they took over in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and so on. We can't say as much for Jews and Zoroastrians, who are also numerous in the Near East, because we just don't have any evidence for them, unfortunately. But you remember I said before that the Quran is notoriously difficult to interpret and to understand, given that our knowledge of what it was and how it arose is so uncertain. So how can we be sure that, in fact, these people did really think of themselves as believers and that their movement included Jews and Christians? Are we maybe deluding ourselves, being misled by willful interpretation or misinterpretation of a couple of passages in the Quran? Well, to answer this question, I think we need to turn here to the documentary evidence from the 7th century. And there are various bits of documentary evidence that come in handy here and that are quite interesting. So for the idea that this was somehow a movement that was motivated by a religious impulse above all, some of the earliest documents, including coins, seem to confirm this. This picture shows when the new community expanded into the Near East, into Sasanian and Byzantine territory, it took over a lot of things, including the mints of these governments that had been there before. It took over the mints and the mint workers and the dyes for the coins. And so after a few years, they started minting their own coins using the same mints and the same dyes. And so what you see here is a coin which is exactly like a Sasanian silver dram. And you can see on the obverse the head of the great king here with distinctive hairdo. And on the reverse, you actually have a fire temple with two attendants on either side, not a very Muslim imagery at all. And it's got Middle Persian writing around here of various kinds in Pahlavi or Middle Persian, which was sort of the official language of Zoroastrianism and presumably of the Sasanian dynasty as well. And yet, you see here on the margin, there's a countermark, we might call it. They've taken the original die and they've added something. And this is in Arabic, and it says Bismillah, in the name of God. So this is, of course, a very common phrase in the Muslim tradition, but it shows that, you know, they're marking their presence by putting this countermark on the coins. And it's an explicitly religious slogan. Now, you can say, well, they were all these people in this expansion movement. There were a lot of people who just jumped on the bandwagon because you know, it was exciting. They could go conquer new lands. They could get plunder and booty and slaves and whatever they wanted. They really weren't interested in monotheism or anything else. That may be, but nonetheless, somehow the leadership of the movement expressed itself in this distinctively religious terminology, which I think helps to kind of reaffirm some of the ideas we find in the narrative tradition. Did they think of themselves as believers? Well, we find some inscriptions from the 7th century that seem to confirm that they thought of themselves this way, because we find some inscriptions that talk about the leader of the movement as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers. So if he's the commander of this community, and it's the commander of the believers, presumably believers is what the community thought of itself as being. This is quite a famous inscription. Actually, it was first published, I think, in the 1950s by George Miles. It's found in Ta'if, sort of above Mecca and the hills above Mecca. And it's an inscription commemorating the construction of a dam by the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or commander of the believers, Muawiyah, who ruled from 640 to 660, I think. Somewhere you can see in here Muawiyah, Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the believers. And then it goes on and talks more about the construction of the dam and who built it and so on. So that seems to kind of confirm the character of the movement as a believers' movement, that they thought of themselves as believers in the 7th century. Or we also find some papyri from the 7th century. Here's a scrap. You're going to see it several times today from the collections in Vienna. You know, the dating system of Muslims today, if you see a date, it's the date of the Hijrah. It goes back to the Hijrah, the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina. But we don't find the word Hijrah in these inscriptions or in early datings. Not until about 300 of the Muslim era do we find it. What we find, though, in the 7th century are some documents that are dated in something called Qada al-Mu'mineen, the jurisdiction of the believers, which again emphasizes the idea that they're believers. So we find a number of these documents with this dating form in the Qada al-Mu'mineen, referring to the jurisdiction of the believers, which means, well, their government was seen as the rule of the believers. Other evidence beyond the Quran for the idea that the movement was open, or shall we say non-confessional, included Jews and Christians as well as Quranic believers. There's a document, or what can we call it, a transcript of a document, which is found in the later narrative sources, but which every scholar who looks at this says this must be an actual transcript of something very, very old. It's usually called the Constitution of Medina, or the Ummah document, or the Sahifa, has various names. But one of the things it mentions is it lists a number of Jewish clans in Medina, Yathrib, who are part of this pact making up how this community is to be constructed. And it includes Jewish clans as part of the Ummah, as part of the community. It explicitly says that. So this seems quite clear that there were Jews who were considered in some way as part of this community. And from many 7th century literary texts in Syriac, so these are the Christian texts that are earlier than the Muslim literary sources, and they tell us sometimes about the beginnings of Islam. We know that many Christians served in the Umayyad court. They served in the Umayyad army. They served in the bureaucracy, sometimes even as what we would call the prime minister. John of Damascus is a famous one, served the Umayyad caliphs or emirs al-Mu'mineen in Damascus. But we have many, many references to this. Also in the Muslim sources we find, especially in poetry, we find references to Christians being part of what we usually think of as the Muslim armies in the 7th century. Even one passage, a very interesting one, where the Christian writer says these people came and they sent campaigns every year to the far horizons, and they conquered and they took lots of captives and brought back lots of booty. And among them there were many Christians, both from our sect and from the heretics, another Christian sect. So it seems like there was some kind of cooperation here between this new believers movement and many people in the Christian communities as well. Or another one, there was a bishop, an Armenian bishop in the 7th century named Sebeos. Someone using his name, scholars call this text Pseudo-Sebeos. Someone wrote a chronicle and attributed it to Sebeos in the 7th century. And it gives us one of the very first descriptions of the career of the prophet in a very truncated, very brief, but it does talk about the prophet and how he was a teacher and taught them, his followers, the laws and so on. One of the things it says a little farther on, after the prophet has died, it talks about how they conquered Jerusalem. And it says they appointed as the first governor of Jerusalem a Jew. Now this factoid, this bit of information, is not confirmed in any of the Muslim sources or in any Christian source, other Christian source. One can ask, was this bishop, Christian communities in the 7th century were very strongly anti-Jewish. They engaged in a lot of anti-Jewish polemic. Maybe he didn't like these people, these new people, and he just wanted to discredit them, so he said they appointed a Jew as a way of just smearing them. But maybe they did appoint a Jew as the governor of Damascus, of Jerusalem. We don't know. We have no confirmation of this fact, but it's very suggestive in the light of all these other bits of evidence about some kind of symbiosis or cohabitation of the people we usually call Muslims, or believers from Arabia, and the Christian and maybe other communities of the Near East. So how long did this sort of open construction of the community last? The change to Islam as we know it occurs, I think, around the year 690, 700, or it starts at least then, under the Umayyad dynasty. It's basically a kind of shift in focus. The believers now are defined as those not just who believe in one God in the last day, but as those who believe in one God in the last day and who follow the Quran as their scripture and who accept Muhammad as the prophet who brought the scripture. And actually, to this day, that's still the simplest way to define a Muslim. As you know, Muslims fight each other all the time, as most people in most religions do, Shiis against Sunnis and so on. But one thing they all accept, or the two things they all accept, is that the Quran is their scripture and Muhammad is their prophet. About everything else they may differ, but on that they agree. And that seems to have been the focus of this new construction of what the community of believers was. And in addition to this new construction with this new emphasis on the Prophet and the Quran, they also engaged in a kind of rebranding or renaming of things. They started to fish out of the Quran various words and to change the meaning from what it had been in the Quran somewhat into something else and to use it in this new way. So they found this word Islam, submission to God's will, and they made it into Islam, into the name of a reified religion. And there are many other examples of this. So what they're basically doing is, you might say, Islamicizing Islam or Quranicizing Islam. They're connecting it to the Quran. They took a number of institutions and practices that had developed in the 7th century, found words in the Quran that could be applied to them, and then applied those words to them, and that became the new terminology. The easiest example to follow is the name of the head of state, the Amir al-Mu'mineen. That's a nice term. Everybody knows what it means. It's obvious, and it's, grammatically and in every other way, but it's not found in the Quran. And so they found a word in the Quran, Khalifa, which means it's applied to a couple of prophets who were sent to sort of supervise their communities with God's guidance, and that was applied to the ruler of the community. So now we call them caliphs. That comes from the Arabic Khalifa. So instead of Amir al-Mu'mineen, they start calling the ruler the Khalifa, using a Quranic term instead of a term that didn't have the Quranic pedigree, you might say. So as I say, this is part of a broader relabeling or rebranding process that's going on, it seems, starting in the 8th century and afterwards. So this is a photograph of the inside of the Dome of the Rock. I'm sure you all know the building. It's the Golden Dome building in Jerusalem that was built by the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or Caliph Abdul Malik, around 692, just as this change is beginning to happen. And inside it, it has these beautiful mosaics all around the inside of the octagon. And included in the mosaics is a long passage of writing. And this writing is generally considered to be, it's quotes from the Quran, various quotes from the Quran. Many of them are passages that are very critical of the concept of the Trinity, the Christian concept of the Trinity. So it's really drawing a line between the people we now call Muslims and Christians who believed in the Trinity. It also talks about Islam, and it talks about Muhammad, the prophet of God, and so on. So it sort of emphasizes all of these things that I've just talked about, how Islam is the name of the new faith, Muhammad is the apostle, and so on, and this is part of the Quran. So what am I doing in Berlin? Basically, I have a double project. One part of the project is to edit fragments of papyrus from the 7th century that I found some years ago in Vienna, and trying to edit these up, however small and miserable the fragments may be. I want to edit them up and publish them so that scholars don't have to do the same thing and try and find them all again and then try and read them again. They can just look and see what they say and use this in their historical reconstructions, because I think that given the general dearth of documentary evidence for the 7th century, it behooves us as historians to get every bit we can into circulation. And so that's what I'm trying to do in that part of the project. And the second thing I want to do is to, in Berlin in particular, is to look here for more evidence of this kind of change in the community in the 7th century, especially searching in the collections of Arabic papyri at the Neues Museum, the Papyrussammlung in the center of the city. This collection seems to have lots of Arabic papyri, but the collection was difficult for most scholars to access from 1939 until very recently. During the war, the papyrus collection, like much else in the museums, was packed off in salt mines somewhere for protection, so they wouldn't be destroyed. After the war, Berlin was divided. The museums were on the eastern side. It was not easy for scholars to work on this material. After the reunification, they consolidated the museums, but they had two different cataloging systems, so they didn't want to let anybody see anything because they didn't know what they had, really, with two systems. They had to unify the system. So it's only been in the last 5 or 6 years, I think, that the papyrus collection has become really opened up to scholars to work on this material. And with the assistance of the director of the papyrus collection, Dr. Verena Lepper, who unfortunately couldn't come today, I'm looking forward to digging into that material. So I'll be spending some of my days downtown in the papyrus collection. One challenge in doing this is that only a very small proportion or percentage of the Arabic papyri that survive are from the 7th century. Most of them are from the 8th or 9th or 10th century or 11th century, when papyrus goes out of use. Paper replaces it in the 11th century. In most collections that I've seen, the proportion is about, of 7th century papyri, are about 1/4 of 1% of the total number. So you go through 1,000, you might find 2 or 3. So now you never know. I might be lucky. I might find 4. And it might be something larger than this. What we hope is we'll find something quite large. Well, how do you tell that it's a 7th century papyrus? That's a good question. Well, you can do it, fortunately, on the basis of the paleography. The writing of Arabic papyri seems to change rather dramatically around 700. I'm not quite sure why, but it does. And certain letter forms that are used in the early papyri simply go out of use after about 700. So if you see those letter forms, you know that it's a 7th century papyrus. In this case, for example, there's a letter called Ain, and it has a distinctive letter which in later Arabic has a kind of looped top. But in the early Arabic documents, they make it like a V. So you can see one of them there, surrounded by red. There's an open-topped Ain. It's a final, in the medial or final position, it will show this way. So this is like a dead giveaway right away. If you see one of those, you know you're onto something early. And then you can look at other letters which also change their form and sort of confirm that this is, in fact, a 7th century papyrus. So, you can look at a papyrus for a minute or less and say, no, it's later, no, it's later, no, it's later. And you're going to be doing that a lot until you finally find a few of these pieces. So, of course, I'm hoping to find lots of them. I'm not sure I'll find many. And, of course, the challenge once you find them is you have to read them to figure out what they say. And this is also not so easy because often the writing is torn. I mean, this one is pretty clear. What's available is clear. But, what was over here? Or on the lines above? Or in the line, we don't know. But you get what you get, and you try and work with it. One hopes one would find more complete documents. And I think as my last slide, I'll show you a more complete document that I found. Guess what, in all places? Chicago. It was in the small collection we have in Chicago of Arabic papyri. And I apologize, it's a very dark picture. As you can see, it's not without its problems to read, because after the initial stuff which tells you who it's from and a lot of polite phrases about, I hope you're well, and we worship God, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, now then, it's about to get into business, and then you get this big hole, right, where it's telling you what it's about. But then it goes on for like another 20 lines down here, and it's quite informative. It tells about the distribution of a relatively small amount of money amongst a bunch of people who seem to have been associates. It's exceedingly interesting. It seems to me to be maybe the earliest Arabic letter we have, and yet the format of it, the epistolography of it, is exactly like much later Arabic letters. So it looks like the writing of Arabic letters was something that was already well practiced even in the 7th century, which suggests that actually Arabic was being written before the rise of Islam, but we just don't happen to have any examples of it. And this may be the earliest one. It's also interesting in other ways. It has all these, typically, we would say, Islamic monotheistic formulae: in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. At the end it says, peace upon you, and the mercy and the blessings of God, the mercy of God. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. But nowhere does it mention the Prophet. Nowhere does it mention the Quran. Nowhere does it cite the Quran. Nor does it have any Christian or Jewish formulae. It's monotheistic, but it doesn't seem to be confessional. Does that tell us something? Well, it might fit into the idea of the believers movement. It doesn't prove it, but it certainly doesn't disprove it. Anyway, I'm hoping I'll find, a couple dozen of these, but we'll see. So, thank you very much.
So, Fred, the actual process of your work, it sounds very much like a Sherlock Holmes with a PhD trying to piece together stuff. I mean, there's a quite exciting part to this, I imagine, because you don't know what you're going to find.
No, that's exciting. I don't wear the same kind of hat.
No, I noticed.
But nonetheless, there's something akin to detective work.
And as you say, the 7th century papyri are quite rare. So you must get quite a buzz when you've gone through a whole bunch of stuff and suddenly you get one.
You know, when I was working in Vienna, they have 25,000 more or less usable pieces. They have 65,000 papyri in Vienna, or numbers, accession numbers, but 40,000 of them are like postage stamps, little tiny pieces, Or in one case, it was a great big sheet with one word in the corner. Isn't going to tell you much. But they do have 20-some thousand quite, sizable pieces of papyrus, at least as large as the one I showed you, the little corner, which is informative. And many, they're complete texts. But fortunately, they had them all microfilmed in the 1960s. Now, yes, it's microfilm, black and white. You have to sit in this reader machine, and crank through. But it was great because I could just go through and look at an image, late. Look at another image, late. Look. So I could work through, I worked through those 22,000 in like 2.5 months. It was a very efficient way to work.
And every hour or so, somebody would hear you shouting, "I've got one."
No, every week or so.
Every week?
I would find one. Actually, it was interesting because a lot of them came up in a cluster right in the middle, around 11,000. So I was going for weeks without finding anything. I said, this is really a bummer, And finally, all of a sudden, I hit this mother lode of about 40 of them. They were all more or less cataloged together. So they were probably a lot that had been found in Egypt together and were sold to a dealer together and bought by the guy who gave them to the Austrian library together. And they were cataloged together. And so there they were. Whereas many of the others were from other parts of the trash heap that were from a later date. That's where most of them come from. They, when people in Egypt over the centuries, they'd had old documents. They were no longer useful, letters from your grandfather. They threw them out. They threw them on trash heaps outside the villages. And then the peasants discovered, well, this is organic material. So they would pitchfork it into their wheelbarrows and take it and spread it on their fields as fertilizer, help things grow. And then about 1850, and including these papyrus documents, around 1850, they discovered that these crazy Europeans would buy these things. So they started saving them and selling them to antiquities dealers, and they ended up in the antiquities market and then in museums. So that's how they... Actually, the ones in Berlin are different. The ones in Berlin came from excavations in the early 20th century. They were excavated from Elephantina, I think, and they found a lot of papyri sort of somewhere, some layer in the excavations. And so they boxed them all up in big wooden boxes and shipped them to Berlin in like 1906 or 1907.
So the text of the Quran is pretty sacrosanct for Muslims. And as you say, it actually doesn't contain a lot of historical material per se. But what has been very controversial, even within Muslim the world of Muslim scholars, have been the hadith, the sayings, the supposed sayings of the prophets,
right.
of the prophet.
Good that you add supposed, yes.
And there are all these categories of how reliable a saying, how many people have supposedly written it down, what's it. Would your work have any impact on that whole debate, which is still ongoing within the Muslim world?
Not really. I mean, I have basically avoided using hadith material.
Yeah.
My feeling is, there are undoubtedly some hadiths that are authentic, something the Prophet actually did say in this collection of material. But there's so much other stuff in there that we know he couldn't have said. And the problem is there's no way really to tell one from the other. There's no sort of foolproof method for discriminating or deciding what is an authentic prophetic hadith and what is just something that someone later on wanted to put in his mouth. And so as a historian, I feel like I can't really use any of this. So I haven't used it in my own work really for support as evidence for anything. I just don't think we can. I don't know whether there's going to be a way ever found to do that. The Muslims tried very hard. Muslim scholars already in the 9th century were keenly aware that there were lots of forged hadiths. There were people making up things that they said the Prophet had said, to sort of bolster their own particular political point of view or social opinion or whatever it might have been, theological position. But Muslim scholars were aware of that. And so they developed a method to try and screen this material out, the false material, and they did it on the basis of the chain of authorities that transmits it. I think what you're referring to. A hadith consists of a text, a short text usually, you should do something in a certain way, and then it would say, someone told me, my teacher told me, on the authority of his teacher, on the authority of his teacher, who heard it from the Prophet, this was what you should do. Well, these chains of authority then were scrutinized by Muslim scholars. They said, well, it says it went from A to B to C, but B never studied with C. C died before B was born. So this is a weak hadith. It can't be true. So they did that kind of, that's due diligence of a form. And they constructed then a collection of hadiths, which is like 1% of the total number, which were considered the sound hadiths, the one that had strong chains of authority. But even in those collections of sound hadiths, there are many that we know must be fabricated, where the Prophet is seen as predicting things that happened 200 years after his death. I mean, yeah, he was a prophet, but I really don't think he foresaw the rise of the Abbasid dynasty. So we know that the method that the hadith scholars developed was not adequate to sort of screen out fraudulent hadiths, and nobody else has really come up with a better system. Modern scholars keep trying. And they work with something of the same method. I mean, they do look at the isnad, the chain of authorities, but they also look at the body of text and they try to coordinate them. And one thing we can do by looking at the isnads is try to decide when this hadith went into circulation. We can see, if you have many different transmissions of it, you can see how the chains of authority kind of converge on someone. And that person is probably the person who put it into circulation. Even though he said he got it from 3 generations earlier, if you don't have any other transmissions, probably he put it into circulation. So he either made it up or his teacher made it up and he spread it.
So we have a microphone. Johan has a microphone. If you'd like to ask a question, put up your hand. Please ask a question. There's a gentleman back there, I think.
Thank you very much for the presentation. If I understood you correctly, you're saying that this community of believers did not really make a distinction between Jews and Christians and Muslims, especially in the beginning. Were there any practical material implications for this? So, for example, the whole issue of jizya. Right. So there must have been some kind of a demarcation between a Muslim and the Christian and the Jew. Otherwise, there would be no justification for paying this tax. So how would you explain this in the context of your argument?
Well, first of all, I don't think that if there was this kind of broad acceptance of others, believers, let's call them Arabian believers or something, because we don't know what to call them otherwise. We don't call them Muslims, what are we going to call them? And Christians and Jews. They didn't accept all Christians and Jews. They only accepted those who were righteous, or appropriately righteous. It's quite clear in the Quran, those who believe and who are pious and do good work are the ones who are part of the believers' movement. As for the word jizya, which is often taken to be the name for the head tax, in Islamic law of the 9th century and later, it becomes the term for the head tax applied to non-Muslim communities, Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians who are under Muslim rule. But in the early years, as we know from the papyri, jizya seems to mean other things. It seems to mean like tribute. So, or tax in a more general way. It's not clear. So it doesn't seem to have this later meaning of specifically a tax on non-Muslims, as we would say, using the later terminology with Muslims separate from Jews and Christians. That's why it's really hard to talk about it without, we have to escape these categories. And it's very hard to sort of cleanse our mind of these categories, which we have had hammered into us forever, But it's, the term jizya also is one that, where the meaning is fluid somehow in the early period. We find, for example, in the classical Islamic law of the later period, we find the jizya is the term for the poll tax, the head tax on non-Muslims, Christians and Jews in particular. And another word, kharaj, is the term for the land tax. But we find papyri that talk about the jizya of a community on their lands. It's not a head tax, it's a tax on land. And so these terms seem to have had kind of varying usages over time, and we have to be sure we're using them in a way that's appropriate for the time we're talking about. In the 7th century, I think they were still very fluid in meaning, probably. Also, both those terms are found in the Talmud, which is the Jewish scriptures compiled in the 6th century for the most part in Mesopotamia. Usually there's also a Jerusalem Talmud, but and in Aramaic it uses the term kharaj and gazit as terms for taxes. So the Arabic in the Quran using jizya, and in later Islamic law using kharaj, seems to be kind of continuing these notions of taxation that come from before the Islamic period. This gentleman here.
Let's go there and then we'll come over here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Fred, for an amazing talk. So my question about this process of disassimilation, the process of this drawing of lines, as you said, between who constitutes a Muslim and who doesn't. What was the impetus at that point in time, the kind of, general impulses of what led to the drawing of this line?
Okay. Well, I think, I can't say that I know, but it seems to me that this is a distinction that starts to arise around 700, 690s and 700, at the time of the Caliph or Amir al-Mu'mineen Abdul Malik. And I think it's kind of the consequence of empire. By this time, this ruling, we have a movement that starts in Arabia. All of the people in leadership are people from these tribes of Mecca and closely affiliated tribes, a Quraysh tribe. And then they have a whole lot of other tribes and tribesmen who are kind of subordinate to them, but they all speak Arabic, and they go out and they, shall we say, conquer the world or subdue it anyway, bring it under their control, and are collecting taxes and so on. There's a civil war and a lot of fighting, and finally Abdul Malik is able to win out and defeats his rivals. But I think he realized there are two things. First, they realized after 60 years or so of ruling a lot of people who weren't from Arabia, who didn't speak Arabic, that these people are different from us. And they also realized that Christians stubbornly adhered to this notion of the Trinity. And they said, how can three be one? There's one God. There aren't three gods. There's these very interesting passages in the Quran where it says, to the Christians, it says, don't say three. It says, it also says, it's unseemly for God to have a son. The idea that Jesus was God and God's son. This is a non-starter for them. They believe in this abstract single God out there somewhere distant and remote. And, he's nothing like a human being. He's not going to have a son. This is like, how can you talk about it? So they attacked specifically those doctrines of Christianity in very brief terms in a number of places in the Quran. And I think it was the sort of gathering awareness of that made Abdul Malik and his advisors say, we're securely in control now. We can draw the line and sort of, we are going to just rule these people as a ruling elite, a ruling caste, and they're different from us. It may also have come from the Christians and Jews themselves, who may have accepted the believers when they arrived from Arabia as new rulers because they'd had new rulers arriving periodically anyway from elsewhere. So why not another one? You pay taxes to new people, so what? But at some point they realized, well, no, these people are different and they have a different religious take on things. And the awareness of difference may have come from both sides. That's not really an answer, but it's my stab at it.
So where would you draw, please, the line between the historic Muhammad and the mythic Muhammad? Evidently, there's a mythological aspect, Muhammad traveling through the skies and into the sky, and there's a historic aspect, clearly, but some people go as far as to say the religion of Islam, you mentioned it, didn't arise in the area of Mecca and Medina, rather in the area of Jerusalem. Right. So where would you draw the line?
Or South Arabia.
And South Arabia. And again, how would you portray the political interests that led to the way the figure of Muhammad was construed over the decades, if not to say over the centuries?
There are people who argue that Muhammad never existed. Like there used to be people who argued that Jesus never existed because, we don't have actual documentary evidence for it. We only have the evidence from within the religious tradition. But the people who argue that, I think, are rather willful in overlooking a couple of pieces of evidence, not documentary exactly, but there is, for example, a scrap of Syriac text that dates from something like 634, which is only a couple of years after the Prophet died, that talks about, in Syriac, the Tayyaye de Mehmet. It talks about the nomads of someone named, looks like Muhammad, right? So this is like almost immediately after he dies, there is a non-Muslim, shall we say, not from the believers community, a reference to an event involving a raid by these people, and they're associated with the name of a person named Mehmet. So I think we have to accept that, yeah, the Prophet was there. Now, how much more of the, shall we say, mythic construction of Muhammad's life that we find in the traditional narratives, such as I summarized for you here earlier, we want to accept is a really tough question, and there's no answer that we can, no obvious answer we can give to it. My own sense, though, is that the traditional Muslim narrative is not completely off base, that maybe 80 or 90% of it is pretty much sort of what happened, but that there are certain points at which it has given a totally different spin to aspects of that development. And I think, for example, the notion of communal identity is one of those areas where the real picture might have been quite different from what we're given in the sort of traditional narration, the mythic picture. And there may be other aspects, too, where there's a sharp divergence. But I wouldn't be surprised if something like the conquests is found to have happened anyway, more or less as they're described. You know. We can't be sure, but that's my hunch at this point.